So thank you again for all of this. It's really my pleasure and my privilege to be speaking with Sanam. And I have spoken to her over the last few days, and we sort of envisioned this as a free-flowing conversation. Knowing that she's in town, I would have probably reached out to her anyway and asked her for a coffee, and probably asked her some of the same questions I was going to ask her today, but now we're inviting you to sort of listen in. So it's really a great chance to be speaking with someone who's really dedicated their academic, professional life really to social justice, to gender justice in various ways, and I'd like to ask her a little bit more about that. But the plan is for us to sort of continue speaking for about 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and we have this sort of back and forth. And then at that time, we're going to invite the audience to be asking some questions. So if you have some questions, please note them down, and we'll have plenty of time to ask questions or make comments at the end. So with that, I'll just hand it over to Sanam to maybe say a few words about yourself and your personal trajectory.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here, and such a privilege to be leaving Washington, actually, and just being in this beautiful space to think. My trajectory, I am Iranian by background. I was 11 years old when the revolution happened. I went to an American school in Tehran, and it was very international. Our school was in the middle of the city. The protests were happening. They sent us home, and it was Christmas vacation, and my father worked with the oil company, so he was negotiating a lot with the oil workers who were going on strike at the time. And my uncle and aunt and cousins were going away for 10 days, and I said to my sister and I said to my parents, can we go with them for 10 days? And they said, sure, as long as you take your homework with you. And with a suitcase of winter clothes and a whole bunch of school books, we flew on the 19th of December, 1978, and that was it. And I didn't go back until 1986. I returned home in the middle of the war, the Iran-Iraq War, because my father was stuck there. He wasn't allowed out of the country for 7 years, so he wasn't allowed out until 1987. But when I went back in '86, I returned to our house, and my room was like, those of you who know Great Expectations, it was like Mrs. Havisham's parlor. I opened my desk drawer, and my licorice and my bubble yum from age 11 was still in my drawer. And it's been an interesting kind of experience coming back and forth, because I continued to go back and forth to Iran for many years. I got into trouble a couple of times, took photographs that apparently I shouldn't have taken, who knows what else. I was research that apparently was contentious and so forth. But I was always interested in what was going on in Iran, and my sort of calling, if you want, was around how do you go from dictatorship to democracy without going through war. That's been like the driving force of what has always kept me interested in this line of work. And I was interested in England growing up with what happened in South Africa. So I was in my early 20s. I did a first degree in literature, did some work in marketing, thought about the law, thought about journalism, thought about banking, went back into anthropology, and was working in the CNN newsroom in April of 1994, and one screen was Mandela winning the elections in South Africa, and the other screen was the genocide in Rwanda happening. And these two images stuck with me, because I was like, how is it possible to have a camera watching a genocide take place and not act, right? And at the same time, look at South Africa after all these years. How did they manage to come through and not end up in a civil war like we saw in Rhodesia next door and so forth? So that's been the trajectory. I started working at an organization that said they did conflict prevention and conflict transformation. And I have to tell you that it never occurred to me that I was going to be working on women, because I came from an incredibly strong sort of family background of very pioneering women, and I was like, it's done. We've done women. Now I want to do this other stuff. And I realized at International Alert that two things. One was that the women in the organization would have one conversation about an issue or context, and the men were having a conversation about the same context, but a completely different conversation. the men would be up here about structures and institutions and processes, and the women were like, on the ground, what's happening and stuff. So there was that interest. And then we were talking about how do you prevent conflicts, right? And people were saying, well, we need early warning signs. And well, what are the early warning signs? And how do we put things and analyze them and so forth? And as we were doing that, my question kept saying, well, who knows what's going on? Who's the first responder, right? And sure enough, it's women on the ground. And we started looking at places like West Africa and Sierra Leone, and the women were like, we knew that the war was going to start because at night we saw the arms being shipped. We just didn't know who to tell. And the locals know what's happening, the government's here, the international presence is there, and no one is really connecting these two. Then in 1998, we had the first global conference of women from war zones, and it was women who had been fighters, women who had been survivors of violence, and there was a woman from Rwanda, so this is 4 years after the genocide, who stood up on stage and she said, she'd lost 100, well, she didn't say this actually, she talked about peace, she talked about reconciliation, she talked about moving forward. And then I realized later on that she'd lost 100 relatives in the genocide. They'd all been killed. And I sat there and I thought, what kind of a person has that heart, has that kind of a capacity for compassion and for forgiveness and for looking to the future so that others don't experience what they're experiencing. And it was that was the moment that my work switched to working with women because I realized actually when you look around the world, whether it's in Syria or in Yemen or in Colombia or in Afghanistan, there are people who emerge when violence breaks out and when systems are super polarized. And they have the courage and the guts to say, I have to see the humanity in the other, even though we are othering each other. And I have to understand that for the future to work, we can't keep killing each other. And we can't, the whole cycle of the oppressed becoming the oppressor, it has to stop. And we have to find the common ground in the middle and the humanity and so forth. And that's really been, again, the driving force of the work that I do at ICANN. The network is a curated network of women who do this on a daily basis in really, really hard places, and who get attacked, whose families get killed, who get attacked online, in person, by state, by non-state, and yet they persist and they persevere. And my job, where I sit in terms of this network, is we sort of think about it in terms of 3 layers of support. One is personal solidarity, so we're all together and we're all reaching out to each other when things happen. The second is professional kind of recognition, advocacy, giving them opportunities to be known worldwide. And then the third is institutional support, so that we are helping them build their organizations and deepen the bench and really have the next generation, so that it's not just a one-off person, but it's actually kind of replicating the work and the ideas. So that's kind of the broad strokes. And the areas we specialize in is, one is on violent extremism and the gender dimensions of that and the role of women, and the other is on how to do peacemaking and peace negotiations that are inclusive of the voices of women and local constituencies, but also that the issues are gender responsive. So if you're doing a humanitarian response program, say in Afghanistan, you actually think about how do you get food to Afghan women now that the Taliban has come back to power thanks to the failures of the US and NATO and so forth. So it's kind of sounds really simple, and it really should be, but we're working with institutions that are so embedded in the way that they do business that this lens is still missing in the work. Sorry, that was a long way around.
That was great. So many things to pick up on there, and we're going to be returning to some of them. So Mohangi also asked me to talk a little bit about myself and to sort of situate a little bit of my work. So I grew up, born and raised in Syria, and we were sort of reflecting on the fact that you have Iranian, British, and Syrian American, 2 people who emanate from countries once labeled as the axis of evil or as part of the axis of evil, and countries that have also are witnessing or have witnessed significant social movements in the recent past and, of course, in their histories. I was born into a very politicized Arab nationalist family, and that sort of formed my sort of worldview from an early age. Arab nationalism had sort of multiple strands, and there are different kinds of Arab nationalism, but I would say there's sort of three strands that sort of shaped my thinking at an early age were sort of Arab socialism and the struggle for social justice, the struggle against sort of oligarchy and feudalism, so to speak, and sort of how to think about the question of economic emancipation in underdeveloped countries. And that's part of why I went into economics, thinking that economics has the answer. And at least that's what I thought at the time, but I'm much wiser now. I think it involves a lot of the answers. It has a lot of the answers, but of course not all, and it's severely lacking in many ways, and that's why we're here in this setting. The second strand of that is really influenced sort of a struggle against Western hegemony and Western imperialism, I think forms another bedrock of Arab nationalism, and thinking about how the Middle East, North Africa region, the countries I was born and raised into, were targets of imperial intervention and neocolonial intervention. And what does it mean to sort of break away from being that sort of center of interventions, from being incorporated in various and differential ways into a world system in unequal ways and extractive ways. And the third strand of that was very prominent was the struggle for Palestinian self-determination, which for many Arab nationalists saw that it was sort of, that struggle was symptomatic of those other struggles in ways that looked at the sort of support for Israel as kind of a manifestation of that sort of external intervention into the region. So that was when I was sort of growing up in Syria. I came to the US, I studied undergraduate, master's, PhD in economics, got a job at Hampshire. Nothing very exciting happened in the interim other than a lot of studying and a lot of working and thinking about some of those issues. But really what shaped my most recent work was the start of the Syrian uprising in 2011 in part of the Arab uprisings that started in Tunisia and spread throughout the region. This is, to me, it just happened. For many college students, it's maybe ancient history that you don't, that you vaguely remember, but for me, it's very much part of my thinking and my life's work, which is an uprising, a social movement that was demonstrating against political repression, against authoritarianism, against a very unique regime that had what I would say killed political life in Syria. And the social movement was a chance to bring political life into the country in ways that hadn't happened. But the social movement transformed, and as a result of various things, including internal and also regional and external interventions, it transformed into a very brutal and devastating civil war. So that gave us, me and my colleagues who were thinking along the same lines of how do we reframe the debate, how do we intervene in ways that look at this question of security, right, from different perspectives. Both the legacy of securitized interventions into the region, but also securitization by the regimes of the region, of the daily life of the people there. How can we provide thinking and knowledge production that emanates not from think tanks in DC or think tanks that are funded by the Pentagon or think tanks that are funded by increasing other governments around the world that are Western, and some of them are non-Western governments that or explicitly anti-Western, but who also carry some of the same politics of securitization and militarism and repression. And that's when the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, which is a really unique and independent social science organization, invited us to form a group. And what would we call ourselves? And we decided to sort of do a play on, if you're in international relations or security studies, you've heard of the Paris School of Security Studies, and there's the Copenhagen School and so on. So we called ourselves the Beirut School, to be explicitly sort of non-Western and to seize on the sort of the Beirut as a city that was traditionally a haven for dissent and critical thought, but also that has seen its share of wars and interventions